Hi, welcome to Philosophy TV. My name is Joel Velasco. I'm an assistant professor in the philosophy department at Texas Tech University. And Matt, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Matt Haber. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, um, and I'm excited to be here today.
Great, me too. So we're going to be talking about biological systematics and a number of philosophical issues that arise in that field. So why don't I start by saying a little bit about what I think systematics is, and then I'll see if you agree with me. Um, I like to define systematics in this really broad way to make it seem more important. So traditionally, it might be something like the study of the diversity of life in all the ways of thinking about diversity. So that would include at least classification, like what are species, taxonomy, so sorting species into higher taxa like genus and family. Um, Now, at least since Darwin, we know that the diversity of life is the result of evolutionary history. So systematics includes studying evolutionary history and trying to infer that history. That might be called phylogenetics. So, Matt, do you agree with this really broad characterization of systematics? And what are some of the key philosophical issues you think that come out? Why do you think philosophers should pay attention?
Yeah, I think that's a nice characterization. It's always a little bit of a challenge explaining to students what exactly systematics is. Um, I guess a broad sense, I would say something like studying and understanding the diversity of life, and that includes cataloging uh, taxa, trying to discover what their histories are, how they relate to one another historically. So it includes taxonomy and nomenclature and phylogenetics. Um, I think it's a great field for philosophers to pay attention to. One is, in a very broad sense, we could think of Aristotle as one of the first systematists. He had a real interest in cataloging what sorts of living things there were, and this was a philosophically rich area for him to consider. And I think that's still the case today for both philosophers and biologists. One thing I like to look at in terms of the value of studying this field as a philosopher is you have a lot of what have turned out to be core epistemological or ontological problems in the 20th century turned out to be the very same sorts of problems for systematists as they were for philosophers. So, for example, you have disagreements and debates over the very concept of similarity and simplicity, of naming and reference. In terms of studying history, there's a genuine underdetermination problem with regard to phylogenetics. So I think there's just a rich source of empirical and conceptual data for philosophers to find in this area.
Yeah, so a lot of the same problems are gonna come up in other fields, like naming and reference. Of course, that's related. What about specific problems? So one of the most central problems, I guess, in systematics and what philosophers write about a lot would be the species problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, there's lots of different questions that might be called the species problem, as if there's only one. Um, so let me just say a little bit about some of those problems, and then you take off and disagree with me when I say something crazy.
Sounds great.
So, there's of course the obvious question of you have a particular organism, which species is it? So that's one species problem: how to sort organisms into species. But then there's another question of what it is that makes something a species. So for example, let's say we agree that I'm a human, but also that I'm male, and also that I'm a primate. Well, how come males aren't collectively a species, humans are, but primates aren't? So, what is the characterization that makes some unit, say humans, a species? So that might be answered by reproductive compatibility or by some kind of morphological similarities,
Or
some
history.
sort of historical
Yeah.
connection or history, right? Exactly. So that's one species problem, and I think um, that can be separated from other questions. Like
Mm-hmm.
it might be that some unit is a species because of history, but that's not exactly why I'm a human or something like that. That they could
Yeah.
come apart. Um, there's other just general metaphysical questions about species. So, for example, once you have something, say you agree that humans are a species, is that just a class of individual organisms? Is it a set? Is it some sort of individual in its own right? That's sometimes, for some reason, called a species problem or the species question.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about, do you think these are sort of serious empirical issues that biologists need to be answering, or is it purely philosophical, or why is this problem still persisting? Is it because it's just a tricky problem, or?
Oh, those are great. So I agree. There's lots of different versions of the species problem, and they run into each other in interesting ways. So there's a few questions you asked. So first, let me address the last thing you asked me. These are empirical problems, and they're scientifically interesting, and biologists have a research interest in exploring them. But I think they're also at the same time philosophical problems, and I don't mean by that, I'm not trying to draw disciplinary boundaries there. In fact, I'm trying to blur them a little bit. And I think that in order to answer the biological problems, biologists have to have some conceptual framework they're working on, and those are often explicitly philosophical arguments that those concepts are based on. And so, going back to the very beginning, what's exciting and interesting about systematics as a philosopher is that the biologists working in these fields can't help but be engaged in philosophical issues. So, for example, what makes something a species, and what boundaries we think are relevant boundaries often get tied up into philosophical commitments that you find falling out of the general theoretical framework there. Sounds like we're going to be getting a whole bunch of different things, but the question you kind of came to at the end is whether we ought to think of these groups, insofar as species are groups, as sets or as classes or as something else. And philosophers of biology often think of them as individuals, or think that whole categorization is misguided to begin with. That goes back into how we decide, or how we determine, or how we identify some individual specimen as belonging to some species or not. And one exciting shift I think happened after Darwin, once people started recognizing the importance of the central placement of lineages and history, was that rather than asking after some essential property and trying to discover an essential property in order to place something into a species, instead it became a relational problem. So what does it mean for something to belong to a species? That means that specimen has some relation to other parts of that species, or other members of that species, if you think of them as sets or classes instead. In addition, though, I'll add a couple things to the way you've presented the species problem, because I think you're right that from a theoretical point of view, what's really interesting is what counts as a species boundary. What's the relevant way of drawing boundaries around something? First of all, those boundaries aren't categorical, and that presents a real challenge to more traditional ways that philosophers have used to develop classifications. We're used to categorical boundaries, and that's simply not, you just don't see that in biology. Secondly, there's lots of different boundaries, and we can ask whether any one particular boundary is the right boundary for drawing the species boundary line. So, in addition to the, say, evolutionary boundaries that we care about, we might also ask something like, what kind of biodiversity do we care about, which brings our own values into it. And so we might ask what kind of boundaries we think are relevant for preservation.
Yeah.
Those may or may not correspond to biologically relevant or theoretically interesting boundaries. And something else you alluded to, with the species problem in general, I kind of like one way of thinking of it that we've seen a few biologists discuss, and that there tends to be a little bit of a conflict, and you've written nicely about this, between retrospective or historical species and prospective species categories or concepts, where in the former you look to see what the history of groups are and how those things have grouped together in ways that are the results of or consequences of evolutionary processes, whereas a prospective approach looks and tries to predict how groups will be cohesive moving forward. And those often end up being in conflict with one another, which presents a real challenge both conceptually and empirically. I'll put it back in your court since you've written nicely about just that conflict.
Yeah, well, as soon as you bring out a conflict, so I guess we'll give an example here.
Okay.
So it seems to be, one of the relevant kinds of species questions, right, is, well, what is a species? Are they even real? And then, you look out in nature and you say, well, look, humans just look different than chimpanzees. They look different than gorillas. They certainly are different than birds, etc. So there's a kind of natural grouping into these clumps. So definitely, there is this clumping of diversity, right? It's not a smear or a continuum. And then the question is something like, in the future, say, what's keeping these clumps together or spreading them out? For example, just one kind of answer might be, well, just reproduction, right? We share genes lead to traits. So if a group is reproductively compatible, say a population of humans, right, they're going to maintain some kind of coherence through time. Now, the backward-looking thing that cares about history is going to say, well, look, we shared ancestors, so we're closely related, right? I'm more closely related to my siblings than my cousins because we share parents instead of grandparents, and you can just extend that throughout. So humans on that picture are the same species not because they look similar or because we expect them to stay that way, but because we shared very recent ancestors.
Yeah.
Now, once you have any kind of two different answers like that, they can just come apart, right? You can easily imagine that for historical reasons, these two closely related groups, so they're closely related historically, but now they're in different environments and they're going to start to diversify, and they're on the other side of a mountain, so they're going to separate. Whereas in another context, you could have two things that are not particularly close, but yet now they're reproductively interacting and they're going to start coming closely together.
Yeah.
So a question that you might have, an obvious question, somebody comes along and says, well, there's all these different ways of grouping things. Why think that there's any right answer? Why think that there's any fact at all about species? So just to give you the kind of example I have in mind, we classify constellations. We say, oh, sure, all these stars are part of Orion or whatever. But it's clear now we have the scientific knowledge. We know why stars are where they are, and it's just totally arbitrary. There's no fact in nature about the right way to split up the stars into constellations. Mm-hmm. There's ways that seem more natural to us because, our perceptual capabilities are a certain way. So why not say the same thing about organisms? Why not say there's a whole bunch of organisms out there, lots of them are similar, they share various features, maybe they share history, or they're reproductively compatible, or they're under the same selection regimes, or they're all green, or whatever.
Yeah.
Why think that there's some privileged way, some correct way of dividing things up into species? Why not say, hey, that's a pragmatic question, it's up to us?
Good. Let me jump in here because I think it's a useful point for me to say something. You started by mentioning natural groupings, and you nicely came back and explained, or at least cast some doubt on what a natural grouping might be. First, let me just mention, and I think you kind of captured this well. It's important to note that a natural grouping doesn't necessarily imply natural kind. That But then we need something to replace the natural kind apparatus that philosophers are used to. So we can probably come back to whether species are natural kinds or not. I don't think they are, or what natural kinds even are. But natural grouping, moving away from natural kind, doesn't necessarily mean we have to go to arbitrary grouping, though, which is what you describe constellations as being. And I agree there's something accidental about where our position is in the solar system and galaxy, such that we see stars clumped together in a particular way or not. But there's something in between, too. We can have, rather than just arbitrary groupings, we can have stipulated groupings that are theoretically justified. And in that case, we still get these conflicts, but we can fill in a little more. We kind of naturalize natural kinds, if you want, Though I don't think we need to use the word natural or the term natural kinds anymore. We can naturalize the notion of what a good grouping is. That doesn't tell us which of those groups are species groups, mind you. But I think that I mean you're right that you get all these different conflicts. It's not just the two we mentioned, as
Right,
you and I
of
have
course.
discussed many times. There's lots of different theoretically relevant and interesting ways to group organisms, and those end up creating all sorts of conflicting classifications or conflicting groupings. And on top of that, each one of those groupings will have these gradient boundaries rather than categorical boundaries in many cases. And I think what one really important discovery of the 20th century in taxonomy and systematics was recognizing that it's important not to conflate these kinds of groupings together. And so whether you want to have a retrospective or historical grouping, both of those will be informative for each other. But if you try to make one big old giant classification that just takes all that information and doesn't distinguish it carefully, then you're going to be in danger of conflating that information and getting groups that end up being incoherent and end up generating conflicts within the theory. So that's kind of the lesson I've been taking, especially more, I guess, for a while now. That's the lesson I've taken from 20th century classification and systematics, is that as people began to recognize, or as biologists began to recognize all these conflicting groupings and what they do, progress started to get made once very fine distinctions were made in what the classifications were up to. And that's created a real problem for systematics, in that there's lots of really good classifications, and all those classifications, especially for people who are monists or really wedded to their particular classification, all have some claim to being a good classification of species. And so there's a pretty complicated and often heated negotiation over which of those groupings we ought to designate the species groupings, if any one, or if not, how we navigate and negotiate through that pretty messy outcome.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask you about there's been some recent work, for example, Kevin de Queiroz and others, and then some recent books by philosophers like Richard Richards and other people. So I think the idea here is that even though, for example, I sort of was waving my hands at, oh, look, these classifications can come apart, the idea is that really either they don't very much, or really once you make a distinction between a way that you might tell that something is a species and sort of what really makes it a species, really there's not that much conflict. Or really maybe there's going to be some vague cases, but it turns out actually we all agree on what a species is. It's pretty clear. Think about humans. Sure, it's hard for me to tell you exactly what it is that makes me human, or that makes, maybe there's going to be some borderline cases, with Neanderthals or something. But basically, everyone agrees. It's pretty clear. And the answer is something like, well, you look at just historical lineages. So you see there's this pattern through time. The species is just this, let's say, individual, kind of cluster of organisms that are causally related in a certain kind of way. Just go through time. They're born, right? There's a speciation event. Eventually, they'll die out when they go extinct. And in between, there's a species. Do you think, and so the view, say, by Kevin de Queiroz is that really there's this kind of general lineage concept. Everyone basically agrees, and sure, biologists fight about it, but they don't need to. Really, we kind of all agree on what really matters. Do you think that's the case, or do you think, I would say no, there are real genuine conflicts that aren't just a few individual organisms here and there, but really fundamentally different way of viewing the world. Do you think, after all, biologists get along. They write field guides and they can talk to each other. So, how extensive could the conflict really be?
Oh, I think that's a nice question. I think that really pushes what the relevant problem is. One thing I tell my graduate students not to do in my classes is I don't want just a list of all the different species concepts available. That's kind of been played out, I think. But I think there's still a lot of very interesting work to do with regard to what's traditionally been called the species problem. Um, I find the Richards de Quiros line attractive, but like you, I think maybe not as much as you, or maybe probably in a different way. I think there's a lot of conflict still there, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
I agree with them, and I think you and I probably agree on this that whatever species are, if we want to hold on to the notion of species as a good concept or a good real thing in real things in the world, species are some sort of historical lineage. De Quiros calls them segments of population level lineages. I think though that view is a move in the right direction, but it's in the right direction because it pushes the right debate to have, in my view, which is that it pushes a problem to what a lineage is. And there's, just like with the problem of grouping species, there's a very similar related problem in grouping or in identifying what a lineage is. And as you've written about and others have written nicely about, lineages themselves are very complicated, and it's not obvious what part of a lineage you ought to track, because if you track a gene, the genes versus chromosomes, nuclear versus mitochondrial DNA, or organism histories, you end up getting different histories there. And those are, in some sense, different lineages. In another sense, the sense I like to think of, lineages are complex, multi-level objects that have lots of different histories. So my view is that this move towards reconciliation around the lineage is the right move, but there's not been as much work done on recognizing that just as much conflict arises at the level of the lineage also, and that's where I see a lot of interesting and exciting work right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what if I posited the view that it sounds like you're saying, well, really, there's lots of different histories. Genes have their own histories, organisms have their own histories, populations have their own histories. What if I said, look, let's just figure out what all the histories are. That's an epistemological problem, but metaphysically, these things are fixed. I guess maybe this is a line by Brent Mischler or some other people. And you say, there's this tree of life, right? Everything is connected. We're all there. It's hard to figure out what it is, but it's all there. And then there's just no further question. If you come along and say, oh, but which things are species?
Yeah.
Then you just say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
That we don't need any distinction. So it's true, it's a fact that I'm more closely related to this particular chimpanzee than to this other gorilla. But why does that mean that we have to classify a certain, or maybe we can group things a certain kind of way, but we don't need to say which ones of those are species.
Yeah.
And with humans, it's kind of confusing because everyone sort of agrees.
Well, humans are a lousy
look,
case.
Humans and chimps, they're just so different. Right, we're the worst case. But so let me
Well,
give you a
we've pretty much
case
killed
and
off
then an
anything
answer.
anywhere close to us. So we're unusually isolated.
Yeah,
We're unusually isolated as a lineage. Most
Right, relative
species
to our
or
neighbors,
most
yeah.
lineages have a lot more
Right.
overlap and in lots of different ways. So we're not a good test case.
Right.
We're an extreme example.
Right. So this is a test case that I use with some others sometimes. So in December, I think 2011, there was this paper, I think it came out in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, about elephants. So I don't know if you know anything about elephants, but when I grew up, I learned, well, there's two species of elephants. There's the African
Right.
elephant and the Indian elephant. And then it turns out, if you're a little bit more advanced, well, actually, there's two different kinds of African elephants. There's the savanna elephants and maybe the other one, forest elephant or something like that. So they all have their own names, but those things are just two different subspecies of the same species. Well, now comes along, we do these careful empirical studies, and it turns out that the two groups of African elephants really haven't been interbreeding very much for quite a long time. They're still capable of interbreeding. You put them in a zoo, they'll interbreed. That's no problem. There's some hybridization in nature, but if you look at the DNA, you can tell they've been separated for quite a while, more than 1 million years. Now somebody comes along and says, okay, so that's a new species. Really, there's 3 species of elephant. There's the Indian elephant, and then the 2 former subspecies of elephants really should be full species. Now, they posit this, and there were some responses that said, no, you're crazy. Though they're just too similar. They really ought to be the same species. And it seems like there's kind of nothing that could possibly settle it.
Yeah.
Right? There's empirical questions you can ask. Like, really, how recently related are they? How common is hybridization?
Right.
Right? You can ask all of those empirical questions. But let me just posit a particular view that says, even if you knew everything, there would be no fact of the matter about whether there was in fact one species of African elephant or two. And then now let me go further and say that's symptomatic of the general fact that it's not just this, that's a special vague case. But in fact, even for humans,
Oh, yeah.
what makes humans a species and not all the great apes? Well, it's just convention, right? There's the historical fact that the two African elephants are closer to each other than the Indian elephant, but there's no biological fact about species. I take this to be quite a radical, eliminativist view.
So this is the view that you and Barker.
What could be wrong with that?
This is a view you and Barker hold, correct? Give or take.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
We have a recent paper about, conventionality and grouping and populations and things, but I don't think we defend, or I wouldn't want to defend.
Okay. Just want to make sure
says this is definitely the right way to go. Yeah, I just want to put this forward and say, I think as a matter of fact, some people have put it forward, say Brett Mischler, and there's a common response by biologists or whatever that this is crazy. This is too radical.
They like species.
It doesn't recognize real divisions in nature. Yeah. So, but why? I mean, do you like real divisions in nature? Why can't we just?
I like real divisions in nature, but at the same time, I should come clean and say that I've almost just as kind of trying on a view. A recent paper of mine, I've got a section where I take Mischler's position and I kind of push it a little bit further even. So Mischler's paper, or one of the papers that he articulates that view, is called "Getting Rid of Species." Part of his argument is, look, retaining the notion of species is a mistake because it encourages us to compare unlike things as though they were comparable, right? And this is part of what I was describing earlier in conflating distinct classifications and trying to use those as comparable groupings. You generate artificial conflicts that are merely a consequence of your convention, as you might put it, or as you might have just put it. So I have a section in the paper where I apply this to organisms, and I titled this section "Getting Rid of Organisms," and I make a similar observation that there's lots of different concepts of what an organism might be or what constitutes being an organism, and conflating those different kinds of groupings and comparing them as like objects generates real problems. And instead we ought to just be looking at individuals. Now I'll make the case. I think there really are divisions, though. And part of the point of that section is, look, that something like being an organism or even being a species is an evolutionary product. It's a character of ways of grouping or ways of being organized. And because it's a product of evolution, we ought to expect there to be variation in how that gets expressed. And there's going to be some reasons that you see some expressions rather than others, but we ought to expect to see a variation of that expression. And so it's useful to use the apparatus of individuals and then designate individuals in terms of strategies or expressions of individuality. So Thomas Pradou's recent work has been articulating a view of organisms in terms of immunology. So how do we consider a group of things to be a single object, a single individual? Well, it's in terms of how they participate in immunological processes. So that's an immunological individual, which he makes a case that that's an organism. We might think of other ways things might act as an organism. And I think we can import that kind of strategy at the level of species also, that it's not merely conventional that there are these different groups, but it's a fact of the way evolution is unfolded, that there's lots of different ways species can group together. And it also turns out that in many cases those are coextensive, and that there isn't, in practice, a huge amount of conflict, especially about the things that are charismatic megafauna, right? The things we really care about if we want to go to a zoo and see something neat with our kids. Generally, those boundaries, although there's a lot of fuzziness here and there, the different species concepts tend to pick out very similar sorts of boundaries. But it doesn't mean there's not genuine conflict there. And I think some of that conflict also, some of that conflict goes away if we take a diachronic perspective, or if we recognize, look, speciation is a process. Species aren't just born out overnight, although sometimes in plants it can happen a little bit, right? But something like the elephant case, the way I would think of a case like that is that suppose we knew all the facts, or all the entire history and everything we need to know. Does that tell us where that species boundary is? Well, it won't. But that doesn't mean we need to resort to conventionalism. What it tells us is something like, look, the African elephants they're in the process, perhaps, of diverging. And that's a process that takes a long time. It can happen along lots of dimensions. And we need to be able to recognize that sort of thing. And here's another case. A recent case I really like that you have the same sort of thing happening is with polar bears and brown bears. It was a paper in early 2012. So if you look at the mitochondrial versus nuclear DNA, the nuclear DNA shows a split and a pretty good isolation of the polar bear lineage, I think about 600,000 or 700,000 years ago. But the mitochondrial DNA shows a split about 120,000, 115,000 years ago. And what happened is there was a female brown bear who mated with a polar bear, because the mitochondrial DNA is half the population size of the population of nuclear DNA. You coalesce quicker. And so all existing polar bears have descended from that hybridization event, but they've also descended from that deeper event as well. And there's no one absolute phylogeny. Is a phrase I like to use. There's lots of phylogenies there. There's no fact of the matter about where that species split. What we can do, though, is look at that history, and we recognize it's a pretty rich, complex history. Now, I agree. I don't exactly know what to do with how do we mark where something is a species, because there's certain cases we really need to use a categorical distinction, even though the facts and theory don't lend themselves well to categorical tools. And that is that's kind of a nice, fascinating little example for how we balance, say, public policy with our sciences. And I don't know how to answer that. That's a really hard question that I've always tried to avoid, basically.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have anything to say.
Yeah, well, the public policy thing, I'll mention it here. Maybe we'll come back to it. But, of course, the elephant case is particularly controversial. The only reason anyone talks about it is because right now the African elephant is not in the most extreme endangered species category, but it's on some kind of watch list. However, if you split it into two, then each group would be small enough that they would both be endangered. And so this matters a lot, right? Whether you can hunt them and whether you can do things right. So those kinds of things are huge. And it's happened recently. They took
the wolves, I was just going to mention
some kind of wolf off the endangered species list, because after all, they're just the same species as this other wolf, and maybe even the dog. And so there's tons of them, right? So that's a distinction. So I thought, earlier on you mentioned actually this thing about natural kinds and individuals, and I thought now would be a good time to bring this up, because the cases that we're looking at, I guess, it strikes me, we're sort of assuming, well, the hard case is that it's like a vagueness issue. Historically, they're in the process of speciating and they're separating, etc. But that just assumes that really it's kind of history that's uniting everything. But another total natural view of species is that, look, there's a bunch of organisms out there. Sure, maybe that's hard, as you pointed out, to figure out what the organisms even are. But
that's just epistemological.
Say we've got those out. Now, how do you sort them into species? You say, well, there's just these natural groupings, right? They have a lot of the same traits. Think about the general philosophy of science, right? Don't think about organisms particularly. There's, carbon atoms are all the same kind of thing. They all work the same way, right? Even if they have slightly different number of neutrons or something like that. There's, copper is a natural kind.
We might ask Michael
right?
Weisberg
Well,
about
why
this a
not
little
say,
bit also. But yeah, traditionally the way we've thought about natural kinds
right?
is
Well,
there's some, well, let's call it what it is. There's a
right.
presumption of essentialism. There's some necessary and sufficient property that all and only those members of those kinds
Sure.
have, right? Yeah.
Right. And I think, you don't necessarily even have to believe in particular property that matters, or it doesn't have to be an essential property. But the idea is that, we do think we make inferences about things, right? Something grounds those inferences. Why is it that if I see 10 different specimens of copper, they all conduct electricity, why think the next one is going to? Well, they have some kind of intrinsic similarity or something, and the next one, here's the answer, it's the same kind of thing. So it's going to conduct electricity too.
Yeah.
Now, we make this inference with organisms all the time, right? If I see 12, if I'm studying chimpanzees in the wild, right, and I study a couple different, troops of chimpanzees, and I study how they work, and I look at their genetics and their blood types, I'm just going to infer that other chimpanzees are going to be the same way. And the one obvious answer, certainly the answer that I guess everyone in philosophy would have agreed with until at least the 1960s, is that, well, that's because they're members of a natural kind, right?
Right.
A chimpanzee is a natural kind, so chimps don't have to all have identical properties, of course, but there's some kind of intrinsic thing that says that's why they're a chimp, that's why they're the way they are, so they share this other cluster of properties. Now, you seem to be saying you don't think that species are natural kinds. Right. I mean,
well,
why not? Aren't they sort of the prime candidate for natural?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
I love this debate. I think it's a really fun one, and I think it's one that has that generalizes really nicely for philosophy. So, species present a real challenge to the notion of natural kinds. And you're right that often we can, simply by knowing that one specimen belongs to the same species as others that we know about, we can infer a lot of things about that one. And that would seem to lend itself well to a natural kinds ontology. But before I go back to the species in particular, let's just talk about why philosophers of biology, and why you mentioned up until 1950s or 60s, why people would have what was the break? Why would people stop thinking species were natural kinds? Well, one general reason, I think Elliot Sober in his 1980 Evolution, Population, Thinking, and Essentialism, I think he captures this really nicely there, is that what makes a natural kind, what makes something a natural kind is that the members of that natural kind all share some similarity. And what Sober does nicely in that paper is he nicely articulates how things that belong to a species, there might be similarities there, but there's also a lot of variation, and a lot of that variation, in fact, might undermine that similarity that you look for unifying a natural kind. So, again, generalizing back to philosophy, there's this nice literature of, well, what do we make of natural kinds then? So one thing I like to tell my students in my philosophy biology classes is, I kind of start with a little bit of an idealized history. I say, look, let's presume that the history of natural kind thinking started with Aristotle, all right, just as a starting point, right? And for many years, philosophers looked to something like species as a paradigmatic natural kind, and then articulated that natural kindness in terms of similarity. Well, contemporary evolutionary thinking challenges that. Similarity doesn't seem to be what unifies the organisms of a species. It's something else. So we have different options. Michael Giesen and David Hull, their response was, well, look, we've just discovered we were wrong that species are natural kinds. Even though what we thought they were, we're just wrong. And we can hold on to our old notion of what a natural kind is, but just realize that species aren't that kind of thing. They're something else. And they have a view about individuality, which we can get into some other point if you want. But another response is seen by people like Richard Boyd and Paul Griffiths and Samir Akasha. And even though I think where they go with it is slightly different, they want to hold on to the notion of species being paradigmatic natural kinds. But the lesson they draw is, oh, we were wrong about what natural kinds are. We need to revise or replace our theory of natural kinds. So someone like Boyd or Rob Wilson, they develop a theory of homeostatic property cluster natural kinds. Someone like Paul Griffiths does something very similar, but embeds it a bit more in phylogenetic theory. And like Samir Okasha, allows for extrinsic properties to act as defining of natural kinds. So rather than the traditional intrinsic essential properties, you now can have relational properties being what define a natural kind. So I think that the debate's a really fun one, but I think there a lot of different kinds of arguments get pushed together a little bit, and it's important to separate the notion of whether species are natural kinds from whether we should be essentialists about them, and whether essentialism is going to be a monist property, a family cluster. I actually think the family cluster view is a mistake too. I think all the I don't think they should be thought of as natural kinds, but I mean, I'm happy also to recognize I have different metaphysical commitments other people do, and I'm happy to kind of translate that back and forth. So I can make sense of something like Okasha's commitment to extrinsic or relational essentialism. I personally, I kind of take the David Hull view, which is that these old traditional notions of natural kind being defined by intrinsic properties of the members of the kind, whether they have to be all and only or necessary and sufficient, I can relax that a little bit, but I think there's a real utility to that traditional view, and I think there's a utility in recognizing that species are something different than that.
Yeah. Well, let me just push a little bit.
I mean, I'm not sure if you agree with my position.
What you said, but so for example, I think, first I just want to say something about natural kinds. So for example, certainly Dick Boyd wouldn't think of himself as revamping the view of natural kinds. I mean, he's going to say this is the view we've always had, right? Natural kind, the term itself only comes around in the 19th century. You've got Mill and
we basically imported Russell's view on that is where we're hacking as a nice.
I mean, there's no particular reason if you think about. And I mean, don't just think about species. Species are a paradigmatic case, but I mean, anything else that you think about, right? The reason you even have natural kinds is you think. I mean, as a philosopher, the reason we have that term is that, they're the things that ground certain kinds of inferences or explanatory power or whatever, right? Some universal generalizations are confirmed by their instances, some aren't, namely the ones that are law-like or the ones where the predicates are natural kinds and not gerrymandered.
Well, just real quick,
right?
that's the Mill tradition of natural kinds, right? And that's slightly in conflict with the
what other
Russell.
Tradition is there?
So what Russell's is more in terms of my understanding anyway, more in terms of sets and properties and making some of the logical apparatus he's developing work. And so I think that's part of what you see the conflict.
I don't know that history. I mean, you could be right, but if you think about what would make it valuable, right? That is, if you want to have a concept of natural kind that's actually useful, I mean, you could define it in such a way as though it turns out nothing is a natural kind. Well, that would be pointless. But if it turns out, you want the natural things that we pick out, right? We have concepts, scientific concepts for a reason that pick out these groups of things, and it turns out they're not going to, in almost every case, they're not going to pick out things that are sort of really simple, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Those things turn out to be kind of definitional and therefore trivial almost, right? If you think, turns out, for example, you pointed out Michael Weisberg may have questions about the natural kinds of elements or something. Well, elements are, they're a good example of natural kinds, I think. If they're not a natural kind, I mean, then clearly nothing could be, right?
Sober also has a nice discussion on that.
Now let's talk about another option then. If you don't think species are natural kinds, you said that you think they're individuals. Right. What exactly do you mean by that? Of course, there's a kind of analogy. Organisms are individual things, and you might think that Homo sapiens has some analogous things, but clearly they're very different too. So what is it that would make something an individual, and why do you think that's important to make that individual as opposed to kind distinction?
Good. Well, let me respond a little bit to what you said earlier, because this might be one of the worries we had in coming up with this discussion was whether we would disagree a lot. And there's a few things I think we do disagree on. Here might be a nice case. When I look at Boyd's writing about HPC kinds with regard to species, I wish I could pull the quote up right now. I'm pretty sure at one point he says something like, we ought to be looking at species in order to understand what natural kinds are. And I might be paraphrasing a little bit there, because what he might mean by that, and what I think he does mean, is something like, what is it about certain kinds of groupings that give us reliable, successful inductions? Right? And that's a tradition in natural kinds, where natural kinds are just what you're saying, groupings that knowing something about the group allows us to make reliable inductions about the things that belong to that group. And I'm going to use belong to as kind of a neutral way of belonging, whether it's a member of a kind or a part to a whole, or however that might be. And that's a really important tradition in science and in thinking about natural kinds and in metaphysics and philosophy of language. What I find particularly interesting about species is that I think of them as individuals. So I accept the Giesler and Hull thesis that species are individuals, and that's typically contrasted against them being natural kinds. Although I already mentioned that that's a little bit messy, because it depends what you think a natural kind is. But it's also contrasted against species being thought of as sets or classes, or I think mereological sums. And it's unfortunate that the term individual is used in both cases, because it's usually synonymous with mereological sum. So what I mean by saying that species are individuals is that they are historical concrete objects that have parts, not members. That's kind of a rough way of putting it. I think there's a lot more to it than that. And the fact that that's what species are, that they're these physical concrete things, means they can't be abstract things like a set or a class. They're not defined by properties or characters that they have, even if there are properties or characters that all and only organisms of a species have. That may end up being accidental, or that might just be an accident of time as well. Over time, we can imagine species changing quite a bit and retaining identity, but losing whatever property we think ought to identify them insofar as their intrinsic properties. Also, and this is a little trickier, I don't think of species as being defined extensionally. So I don't think a species is defined by its members or its parts, whereas a set or a mereological sum is. A species could have more or fewer parts, and I mean that in a modal sense, not over time. So all those things suggest to me that there's some kind of biological individual, is the way I like to describe it. And what a biological individual is a biological problem. Now, going back to natural kinds, we typically can make really good inductions about members of or other organisms of a species if we know a lot about them already. Discovering a new specimen will tell us a lot about that. But that's a function, that's a consequence of the fact that they're historical objects, and that they're historical objects in a particular way. And that's going back to a very earlier discussion. I think the reason that we can make successful inductions about what belongs to a species is that's a consequence of evolution, and a consequence of what is nicely captured in phylogenetics and in thinking about species as lineages, as you mentioned earlier. Now, whether you want to call that, if you think of natural kinds merely as groups about which we can make successful inductions, then I think you're going to end up with kind of degree of natural kindness. And some species will be the organisms will be much more similar to each other in certain regards than others, and so you'll have degrees of natural kindness. And again, to me, this goes away from what's useful about the traditional notion of natural kind. And I think there's certainly room for natural kinds in biology, but I just don't see species as being a good candidate for that.
Well, Yeah, I mean, isn't it going to be even worse on the individuality?
No, because on
So,
individuality,
let me
we
give you a
expect
kind of.
we expect there to be a degree of individuality and a degree of how things might belong.
So you're saying okay. So
No.
it's not a worse problem. I mean, it's the same problem. In fact, so let me give you the kind of example. This is what if I am trying to explain to my students the distinction between an individual and a kind, and then I try to say, well, look, Homo sapiens goes on the individual thing rather than a kind. The analogy with organisms really breaks down pretty severely at a lot of points. So, for example, if I have an organism and you say, well, there's some kind of, what makes this individual human, a single human? Well, it's sort of functionally connected. There's all sorts of causal connections. If I chopped off my arm and moved the arm to the other side of the world, it's
That's
just
right.
not a part of me anymore, right? Because it doesn't have the same kind of connection. Now, if you look at a human population, it doesn't matter how physically connected they are, they might be interacting, whatever. You take 5 of them, you go bring them to the other side of the globe. It's clear they're not any
That's
less
right.
human. But yet, if it seems like by saying that they're an individual, you're saying that they have some kind of, common causal connection, that they're interacting in some way. But you put an organism in the zoo, obviously that doesn't change its species.
Oh, great!
So
I love
what's
it.
going on there?
So, my view on I haven't really filled in my view on individuality, but one of the central commitments of individuality, on my view, is that there's a biological part-whole relation that constitutes being an individual, and that part-whole relation is recursive. So you get parts being parts of parts of parts of parts. And I like to think of it in terms of lineages. We don't have to think of it that way. And so a biological problem then arises. What happens when what happens when 2 individuals end up becoming part of another individual that then becomes part of another individual, and so on and so on. And so that's what generates, or that's a way of thinking about the biological hierarchy. And the way that individuals may group together to become a higher level individual, or constitutive of a higher level individual.
Right.
There might be biological distinctions at different levels in what sorts of relevant relations there have to be between parts in order for them to belong to the same individual. And you could do this in terms of fitness. That's a popular way that you see with people like Peter Godfrey Smith or Samir Okasha. You could do this in terms of kind of physical continuity with one another. Many organisms are like this, but not all organisms, right? You can take plenty of organisms and pull them apart, and they'll do just fine. And put them on the other side of the world, they can come back together again and do just fine. Like slime molds do this, right?
They can, but wouldn't you say that they're part of 2 different organisms?
I don't know if I
while they're
would.
separated?
I don't know. It depends on the details.
And then, if you put them back together, they
I might
become
say
one
that,
again.
but the reason I would say that is because different ways, different kinds of biological groupings, and again, I think these are evolved strategies for grouping. So we expect to see variation of expression, and we're going to see more successful and less successful ones. To me, these are different ways things diverge and different degrees of coherence or cohesion different levels might have. I mean, I think you're exactly right that there's something about the level of populations. Let's leave aside species for right now. There's different ways that populations can diverge and trade parts or lose or gain parts. Organisms don't seem to do it the same way. But at the same time, once we start looking at microbes and how most organisms need to have lots of other microbes around or in them in order to survive. There seems to be lots of different strategies for grouping, and what the kind of differences you're noting about the way we can move humans across the globe without threatening the identity of the species, as opposed to most organisms, we can't do that. To me, that's indicative of how individuality is expressed at different levels, not so much whether something's a kind or a set or a class. And I think it raises, I mean, ultimately what I care about isn't so much whether we think of these as sets or classes, but what kind of research problems our conceptual commitments are generating. And there, I think, I can imagine someone pretty easily disagreeing with me and giving an account of that sort of thing in terms of sets or classes or distinction between organisms and the levels higher. But to me, what are interesting is, well, why can we?
Yeah.
What's the biological reason? What kind of research problems arise from the way we can split things apart at one level but not other? What is it? What sorts of identity? What under what conditions can identity be retained? Those are the kind of questions I think are the most interesting and that are exciting. That as philosophers, you and I can identify those sorts of commitments and the research problems that follow. And biologists, here and there anyway, seem to actually pay attention to this and care about this sort of thing also. So,
Yeah.
well, what's your view though? You've been asking me most of the questions. I'm curious your view.
Well,
on
my
this,
view on individuality, I guess I don't see any particular. I mean, if you want to define individual in a way that is this really weak notion that just says, look, it has a single name, Homo sapiens, so it's obviously an individual thing or something. I mean, some readings of Michael Giesland make me think that really that's what he means, and then it's sort of so trivial. But then you seem to have a notion of individuality which would actually be important if things were individual, right? It's a part-whole relationship, it's a result of evolutionary history, etc. But the more you push that, then it seems to me the more clear that species, or at least not all species, are individuals. I think there's just such a radically different kind of biological relationship between the parts of an organism and organisms that are traditionally members of the same species. I mean, of course, there's a kind of biological connection between me and you, right? There is some kind of biological connection. Is it enough to make us part of some larger thing? I don't know, maybe. But I'm, there's some ant crawling around in my room right now. I'm connected to that ant in all sorts of powerful ways too, but nothing, nobody says, oh yeah, that's because you're the same biological individual or something like that. So I just don't see the benefit. On the other hand, I do see a benefit of calling species kinds. I think that the notion of natural kind was designed to cover cases exactly like species, right? So I don't see the benefit of moving. I think you can define kind in some way. I guess this is how David Hall thought of it in the 60s and 70s, maybe Michael Giesland, so that, look, hardly anything is a kind. There's a single, necessary sufficient property. It's essential, all these kinds of things. And then it sounds like, sure, species are variable, so they're not the same kind of thing. But, that's just a bad way of defining kinds. And I don't see a particularly problematic feature of calling species kinds as long as you're used to it. And again, I have the inverse thing with individuals. I think if you say species are individuals, you have to be so careful about exactly what you mean in order to make it the case that it's not just clearly wrong, right? So, in the end, maybe it's just a kind of semantic thing. Depends on what you mean by kind and what you mean by individual. But I don't have any problem at all with calling them kinds, and I think it's worrisome to call them individuals. You got to be really careful.
I'll push back a little bit. Then I guess we're running out of time here soon. I want to ask you one other question though, but after that, but I'll push back a little bit.
Sure.
So I agree actually that the individuality thesis it's actually pretty. It's a fairly weak claim. But what I like about it, it's a framework. It's a theoretical framework that demands a lot of filling in with details. And part of what I was describing is the filling in. And that's where I see the biological part of it occurring. And that's what one thing I find really attractive is that it's both a biological and philosophical thesis at the same time. So it demands a filling in of what kind of whole relations are relevant. So why, you and the ant are part of some, you're part of lots of different wholes. You're both parts of lots of wholes. But only some of those are biologically interesting wholes, for example. or maybe none of them are. I don't know. So you don't just get to say it, right? You have to actually have some empirical and theoretical framework there.
Well, are all the animals, does that form an individual?
Oh, do all animals?
Does the collection animals?
Oh yeah, I mean that.
Metazoa.
That, in my view, that would be an individual, and we're both parts of that individual. And I think there's something really phylogenetically interesting about that. That's because it's a monophyletic group, and that's evolutionarily interesting and hugely helpful. At the same time, I agree that the individuality thesis is weak. And I think a major mistake in both proponents and opponents of it have made is in overreading it is too strong, and that's where you get into lots of claims that I don't think can be supported as the individuality thesis, maybe with appeal to particular theories. The same, though, could be said of a natural kind approach. And so insofar as you might say, look, species, I want to call species kinds because I can make successful inductive claims when I treat them that way. Well, that's one thing, right? And that's a pretty weak claim also. And I'm comfortable with that. And I think that's probably what we sometimes mean by kinds. But then the various natural kinds views about species that are actually promoted say much more than that. So you get cluster concepts of similarity. I think that's a mistake. I think insofar as biological species or groups are homeostatically or have these homeostatic property clusters, that's a result of evolutionary history, and I'm not even sure it's always the case. And I worry about things like, well, does that mean if we see a shift in what clusters are maintaining homeostasis, does that entail a speciation event? Because that seems kind of weird to me. That it maybe because homeostasis could be consistent without the properties that maintain that homeostasis. So I think the same kind of I agree completely with you, and that's my goal in developing. I'm in the process of developing worked out account of my thesis of individuality, is acknowledging the weakness of it, and then saying, look, here's why that's useful, though. And in some ways, go ahead.
Well, let me give you a suggestion to see if this turns out. So I think there is this kind of interesting idea that says a species is like the result of an evolutionary process. There's a certain kind of stage, right, where maybe it's one of the major transitions or something, right? So, organisms are a certain way that evolutionary history has resulted in organisms, right? Especially the complex organisms, say animals that are filled with bacteria and whatever. So that's a sort of unique point in history. But now, and I can sort of see some species you might want to say that. You might want to say, look, it's like a new way of organizing the genes or something like that, right? Well, but then it's going to be the case that the ones that seem like individuals, so I don't know, take some kind of ant colony type thing. It's like a new way of organizing things, right? They're beyond the level of organism, but they're still an individual or whatever. Well then, but just not all of life is like that, right?
Yeah.
Not all of life has reached that particular
that's predicted by my
outcome.
view.
But now it's tricky to call it species because, but now, and I think if you embrace that, that's one thing and that's interesting. But species as a term is pretty fundamentally a classificatory term. I think, we say you sort of get organisms into species as though there's not a question ahead of time about whether or not it even is part of a species. Well, of course it's an organism. That's the question. What
that's
species
great.
Is it,
that's great.
Right? Just like so, the more you make them seem like this interesting individual, then you have to say something about how maybe there's a different a different term for the general classificatory project of.
Let me give you a different way of putting that exact same point, because I think you're exactly right.
Sure.
And I think that's actually an advantage of the individuality view, at least my version of it, is that an open question is whether the very first living things belong to species or not, or whether species are species as an organizing or a way of organizing things, I suppose we could say it, whether that's something that evolved. And I think it's something that evolved. And I think that there's good evidence for this in looking at microbes.
Right.
So it's just not obvious whether microbes form species or
Right.
not. And I think the right way to think about things like microbes or
Right.
microbial groupings is that they're transition or they're I don't want to say transition because I'm not sure they're actually transitioning towards anything, but they're borderline cases of species.
Right.
And we should expect to see that sort of thing if species is a unique way of organizing things, as you put it, that evolved. We should expect to
Right.
see those kind of borderline cases.
Right.
And that's just what that's
Right.
just how Darwin thinks about complex properties or characters in the origin. He asks around. He says, "Well, let's look around and see if we see ways that are currently being expressed that might resemble historical transition points." So I completely agree with you that the way I've thought of the individuality thesis does entail that there's going to be these kind of borderline cases, and that could be totally wrong. And if that's wrong, then I
Right.
fall on my face and I got to rethink what I'm doing. But even so, I think that's one nice thing about being a philosopher of biology is you kind of get to stake out fun positions that are a little bit risky in this way, and I think
Right.
it pushes a nice diachronic.
Well, I
position.
think that's a really interesting position. I mean, yeah, I mean, what's tricky is whether the word species is something that you can sort of co-opt for that thing. So, call them evolutionary units or something. If species is a taxonomic unit, it's not clear that it's okay for you
Well,
to
I was gonna.
co-opt
This
that
is what I
term,
wanted to ask you about actually,
right?
because I
When,
think as you've
Yeah,
as
go
you've
ahead,
nicely
ask me,
written
yeah.
several times, a useful distinction to make is the distinction between species as a rank versus species as a group. And I'm curious how you think that what you think that distinction is, if you think it's a legitimate distinction, and how that plays out with regard to taxonomy. Because
Yeah.
you're right, I'm actually kind of moving away from using the term species. So despite my earlier defense of it, I think I defended
Yeah.
it, I can't even remember now. In some ways, I am kind of moving towards a
Right, yeah.
conventional usage of species.
Right.
So I'm curious what your views on this is, and maybe you
Right.
could explain to folks what species as rank
Yeah.
versus group means.
Sure. Well, this comes up because of the history of taxonomy. So we have the sort of traditional Linnaean system that you might have learned in school or wherever, where we have. So I'm a member of lots of different groups. So Homo sapiens, right? That's a species. But then Homo sapiens and chimpanzees are a member of the same group, right? Let's go larger just so it's easy. The great apes, right? They're hominids, right? And then there's primates, and there's mammals, and there's animals. And those things are inclusive, some groups are included in others. This is a set theoretic
Right.
way of thinking about it, right? But, and the idea there is that different levels have different ranks. So if you're organizing something into a hierarchy that you're writing on paper, you might say Homo sapiens is a species, hominid is a family,
Yep.
primate is an order, mammal is a class, right? So, Linnaeus had 5. For a long time there were 7 ranks. Now there's something like 27
At
different
least.
recognized
Yeah.
ranks, because there's order, suborder, infraorder, and then there's superfamily, subfamily, right? So they have to keep finding all these in-between things with names. So then the question now with species is that, which exactly do you mean? So if you have the particular as a rank, you've got a question: is Homo sapiens of the rank subspecies, species, genus, order, etc.? That's a ranking question. You already have this group of individual organisms. You call them a particular group because you think they're evolutionarily united or they're very similar or whatever. But you can ask exactly the same question about the primates or the mammals, right? What's the appropriate rank? Then the grouping question is which things actually belong together. So maybe the grouping thing is the more natural thing. So, there's me, there's you, and there's this bird, and there's an ant, right? And you might say, okay, me and you, we're both part of the group Homo sapiens, but we're also both part of the group primates. Include the ant, we're part of include the bird, we're part of vertebrates. Include the ant, we're part of animals, etc. So those are all different groups, and then for each group, you have the question of what their rank is. Now, the one reason to make this distinction is that the traditional view, which I think just about everybody accepts, is that above the species level, so you've got a group like Mammalia, and you say, Mammalia, is that really an order, or is that really just a suborder? You know, what's the appropriate rank for that group? Everyone says that's clearly conventional, totally arbitrary.
There's no theory of what being an order
not totally
is.
Arbitrary. Maybe you want. There's no theory exactly. You want orders to be similar to other orders in some way, right? You wouldn't want to call, aves a class but mammals a species. That would be kind of weird, right? But other than that, there's no particular ranking question. It's just arbitrary. But yet grouping is definitely not arbitrary, and everybody knows that. So, but as I said, the traditional view is that above the species level, it's arbitrary. So once you have a group like mammals, class or subclass, that's arbitrary. Things change. It's annoying because the names change, but it's just arbitrary. But now the traditional view is that species are special. That there is a reason to think, well, now wait a minute, Homo sapiens, you can't call that an order. That's actually a species. There's a real fact in nature about the level species, about the rank species. And then how you group the species together into higher groups might be done by history, and what their ranks are is irrelevant or whatever. But the rank species might be special. Now, here's a position I've defended in print, and I think is the right...
You're going to stand by your view?
It's sort of the best theory. I still think it's the best theoretical position.
Good.
Yeah, I'm willing to stand by it. And that is that actually there is no fact in nature about the rank species either. It's just like other it's like other ranks. So it's true that there is this mind-independent fact that says there's biological reasons that humans and chimpanzees are members of a group that birds aren't. That's a grouping question, right? But there's no biological fact. Go to the elephants, right? There's just nothing in nature that says, aha, African elephants, that's one species, not two. There's nothing there. Now, what I do think is still open to discussion and worthy of serious consideration is to what extent human conventions and pragmatic needs and whatever can actually make it the case that there are answers to these questions. So I think if you look at constellations, no, even the fact that I call something Orion or whatever, that doesn't, Orion refers to something because there's just this fact about reference, but there's no real, we haven't made it the case that there's constellations out there just by naming them. On the other hand, I'm not so sure with species. There are real properties, like we were talking about at the very beginning. History, biological compatibility, ecological similarity, whatever. There are these real properties that are theoretically useful and biologically relevant, and there's a historical tradition of reference, of us using certain terms, whereby, you would just be wrong. If you said, look, mammals, there's only one species of mammal, you would just be wrong. It's hard to see how you can say that unless there's some source of objective meaning to the term species in the ranking, whatever. On the other hand, I don't think the source can be sort of mind-independent in nature, whatever, but there's some kind of very complicated mix of pragmatic convention plus some objective facts.
Can I jump in here?
You can't just make up a convention.
So,
please.
I think that's a nice discussion. But first, I just mentioned that my view of individuality, I think, actually accounts for your view very well. It's just individuals all the way up and down. Samir Okash has argued for this.
Right.
A few other folks have too, but I kind of like that view. But just putting it out there, But the one thing we haven't really discussed, we're probably running a little short on time, is how naming and reference works in systematics. And something I've said in print is that it's biological nomenclature is a just beautiful example for philosophers of language interested in proper names, because you've got a case where within any given system, each individual species or each individual taxon only can have one unique name, and you can't once a name is assigned, it can never be used for another taxon, and it's just a great test case. Now, in some so the question you're raising is a tension for your view. I don't think it's a tension, but it's something that needs to be addressed. Is, well, look, if you're going to say, look, species is a rank also, and that level of hierarchy is just a convention, just like all the other ranks. The thing about ranks give you a hierarchy, at least in biology, and they're exclusive. So if you're a member of one rank, you can't be a member of any other rank at the same level. And one reason to move away from that is because groups don't have to act that way. You don't worry about a group can be part of a larger group and part of a larger group, or belong to, if you want to have a more neutral notion of it. And so moving away from ranks gives you a little more freedom to freedom for a system that coheres better with what we actually observe and how things belong to each other. But the point you raise is, look, there really do seem to be groups. Those are real, and those groups have boundaries, even if those boundaries can be kind of fluid sometimes. There are genuine clusters. With one way to make sense of to capture both what's contingent and also independent about how those groups are identified and named is that when a species is named or a taxon is named, it's named by type. And the way that works is a type specimen, a physical specimen is set aside and designated as a name bearer for that taxon, so for that species. And that just means it's that species has been ostensibly defined. Namely, you're pointing at the species by way of the type specimen. The type specimen is a physical part of the species, and what you're naming is whatever species that type belongs to. Nothing more is said about it in terms of the definition. You can offer a diagnosis of what we would expect other things that belong to that species to be like, and depending on what you think a species boundary is, or if you don't want to use species boundaries, if you want to use history alone, you can say, look, whatever belongs to the relevant group, the same relevant group as this type specimen, that's the thing we're naming, and it's in many ways that is genuinely arbitrary what it is we're designating as a type specimen. It's what we happen to find. If you've got a box full of specimens, you pull one out and say, all right, this is going to be the type. Whatever else belongs to the same lineage, and you've offered this in terms of exclusivity, for example. That's going to be the thing we're going to be naming here. So I think this is a way that we can make sense of both the fact that there really are, you and I both agree on this, genuinely are really interesting and important groupings. The groupings aren't arbitrary, but our naming conventions do have some bit of convention to them and arbitrariness to them. And how much arbitrary and convention we want to leak in there has been a matter of huge dispute in the systematics community. That might be maybe that's for another philosophy TV discussion. But it's a great discussion.
Or just other discussions some of the time, Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting, if you maybe could end with this. So I think one of the reasons that you think philosophers of language ought to look at the naming conventions of species and nomenclature is that the rules are really rigid and laid out and clear. Sure, there's always controversial cases, but you might think almost that's how philosophers of language wished that proper names always worked.
I think Kripke says that.
But actually they don't work that way in ordinary common conversation, right? So now the question is, I would think that that's a reason that that biological nomenclature is actually not as, or at least, it hurts the case. It's actually not as valuable for theories of language and how naming works, precisely because there's rules that are laid out so carefully, where that's not the normal case. Now, do you think it's the opposite? You think because they're laid out carefully, this is exactly where you should be looking?
Well, I actually think we probably agree a little
something
bit on
works.
this, but I see the point. I think that the fact that the rules of biological nomenclature are, in some sense, very simple, but then there's just amendment after amendment after amendment, and they get pretty complex as they've had to deal with real cases. And so, I suppose where I see the value is here's a model of how proper naming can work, and it's a model that's been empirically tested and has theoretical underpinnings to it. And so then the question becomes, well, how relevant is this to how proper names are in fact applied in ordinary language? Is it a good model for it? Is it normatively useful? So it's not that it's going to be. That's the way I see the value. Is that it's a nice model of how proper naming can work, and in fact, it embodies a lot of the 20th century innovations in naming and reference that philosophers have adopted, and it also reveals some of the problems that might not be evident unless you actually try to apply them. So it's a good test case. I'm a naturalist, so this is a naturalist approach, right?
And that's a good lesson for that's a good lesson for philosophers of science, and well, all philosophers generally, is that you might think, oh, something could work a certain way, or this is how naming ought to work, or whatever. But when you actually look at a specific worked out system as a model and see, is that really what you had in mind all along? It's, it is very valuable, and I definitely agree. There's lots of test cases and systematics like that. Like you're interested in natural kinds, or you're interested in deep metaphysics, you're interested in part-whole things, you're interested in, we didn't even talk about epistemology and inference, but you pointed out right at the beginning, this is one of these cases of, it's the 21st century big data, and looking at huge genomes and trying to infer the past is like the ultimate epistemological problem from the philosopher's point of view.
And the problem of
and it's well worked out, and people have spent a lot of time
people are starting to get
this.
interested in how big data generates unique epistemological problems. We've been looking at for 30, 40 years in at least more than that in phylogenetics. I can't believe you and I talked for almost an hour and a half, and haven't even talked about phylogenetic inference. Maybe we'll have to do another one of these or something. But.
But I think that's, we're interested. We talked about a lot of things already today. So
no, I think it's good.
I think that's going to be it for our that's it for our conversation, and I certainly enjoyed talking to you, and I hope that others will enjoy.
Yeah, Joel, thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. Can't wait to see the end product.
Talk to you another time. Yeah,
great.
I had a lot of fun too.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Matt.